You'll have a meeting every week after you've had your session with the customer where you will sit with your team, and your goal is to go through the stories that came out of that meeting and estimate how hard they are. We have a tool that will help you do this, by the way. The product owner, who we'll talk about a little bit later, this is the person who sort of, when the customer is not in the room, they are the voice of the customer, and you're going to rotate that role each iteration, goes through one story at a time, and people vote independently on how many points they think that story ought to be worth. There's a number of different ways to do it. We're going to recommend that you use one called Planning Poker, which we have a tool that is built in. It's basically like rock, paper, scissors. So everybody sort of thinks for about a minute. They think this, and then you go, OK, 1, 2, 3, and everybody puts down a card showing some number of points. And if your team is getting to where like everybody puts down the same card, that's great. The only improvement on that I can think of is if it actually turns out you're correct, which you will get better at over time. Typically, you will not all agree, and that's where the discussion comes in to say, OK, I thought it was 1, you thought it was 4. Why do you think it's a 4-point story? And at some point, you come to convergence, or if not, maybe you just take the pessimistic vote and say, all right, you've convinced me that it might be a harder story than I think. We're going to call it 4 points, and let's think about subdividing it. Remember when you're doing this that the goal is for the team to get to convergence. So some team members may have more experience with certain things. They may say, oh, yeah, I know the JavaScript to do that. That's not hard. Let me be part of the pair that works on that story. And if we do it, it's a 1-point story. And that's legit. But at the same time, anybody who has a doubt about that should always feel like it's safe to speak up and disagree. Because at the end of the day, it's really the whole project that suffers if the team is not sort of working as a cohesive unit. Okay, so take advantage of the skills that your team members have, and sort of respect that some people have more strength. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that those people should unilaterally determine what the effort is for a particular story. Like I said, if your story is higher than 4 points, oh, I'm so sorry. Question.
If someone knows if it's that situation where someone's like, oh, this is a 1-point thing for me, and other people are like, oh, it's 4 points. Do you then how do you decide how the work is split up? Do you do a paired program and then have someone who doesn't really know how to do it be with that person?
So a question is, if you have a situation like this where one person who's very experienced at something says, oh, for me, that would be a 1-point story, there's a number of things you could do. I think it's a good idea to say, OK, be one of the pair, but work with someone who doesn't know that technology as well. And then next time we have a story that's similar, there'll be 2 people who feel like it's a 1-point story. So using pairing as a way to spread knowledge throughout the team, I think it's self-defeating to say, well, OK, you're the expert on that, but we're going to have somebody else do it so that they learn it. I mean, there's some pedagogical value to that, but it seems a little bit hard-headed to me. So I think if you keep remembering that you're all working toward the same goal, and yeah, that means that in that pair programming session, one person may be doing sort of a lot more of the forward progress, but that's OK. The other person's still learning. So I would use it as an opportunity to spread more knowledge throughout the team so that as you get into the later iterations, you all sort of are being brought up to comparable levels. Good question. Yes?
You ever say no to the customer, for example, if he wants to build Google's PageRank algorithm into his app? When do you start saying no, then his feature cannot be implemented?
When do you start saying no? You start saying no when you actually take these suggestions back to your team and they're like, oh, that's a 38-point story. We won't be done until next semester. No, but the reality is that if the it depends on how specific the customer is, right? If they say something like, we want magic searching on our site, you have the right to say, well, we're going to need a more specific version of the story than that, because otherwise we can't even estimate it. So do you want us to go find some engine that does searching and plug it into the app? Maybe that's what you want. Maybe what you really want is for us to do an integration with Google Enterprise and have the website search become part of your site. That's a specific thing. We can go off and estimate how hard that would be to do. But yeah, sometimes if the customer is asking for the moon, you have to say no, right? Or you have to say that's for the constraints of this team and this project, we don't believe we can deliver a good job on that. And there's no shame in doing that. OK, last couple of things on points. So as I said, the main thing about points, it's not a race to see which team is doing the most points per iteration. The goal is for your team to get consistent so that over time, your ability to estimate, OK, how much is a point and how many points do we think we're likely going to be able to do in an iteration? And then you actually compare. The tool Pivotal Tracker, which I'll introduce you to next time, will keep track of all of this for you as you work on stories. And the goal is that by the end of the course, you're actually getting pretty good at estimating how hard something will really be. A related concept about this that we haven't talked too much about, and maybe this also goes to your question, is the concept of a spike. So the customer says something like, well, I want to have a recommendation algorithm that when someone's shopping on my site that can recommend similar things that other people liked. OK, well, unless somebody on your team is already an expert on recommendation algorithms and plugins or libraries that they can use, if that's a legitimate customer request, someone on your team is going to have to learn about that. And this is when you say, all right, we're going to need to set aside some time, maybe one engineer day or one pair of engineers day, and they're going to do whatever it takes to learn about that. They're going to write crappy code, they're going to hack things, they're going to download stuff, and they're all going to do it in such a way that when they're done, they throw out all that code and they come back to the team meeting and say, OK, now we know how to do it. This is what it takes. We found 4 different recommendation algorithm engines that we can plug in. This is how hard we think it would be to do the integration with the existing app. And now you can actually go back to your planning meeting. So sometimes you'll have to sort of take a detour and say, we don't have the expertise in the team, but give us a couple of days and we'll get back to you with an estimate of how hard that would really be to do. Okay, so, and by the way, when you do find yourself doing a spike, that's a great time to come to your GSIs or to us or Piazza, as well as Stack Overflow, because we may be able to recommend ways that you can speed up the process. We may have some pointers on where you can start your research. This is kind of the part of the course where a lot of students sort of tend to, I don't want to say tune out, but they tend to devalue it a little bit because we're not talking about code. Although actually today we are going to talk about some code. But what we found very consistently in this class is that when projects come, the student teams that do the best on the projects in general, the ones that have good progress, a happy customer, they feel like they're sort of functioning as a well-oiled machine and doing good work, it's because they have a handle on this front-end part of the process, the planning and estimating part. If you do a poor job on that, if you don't really think about how to break up stories and how to assign points, our experience has been that that's likely to translate into an inability to sort of consistently deliver solid stories by the end of the iteration. So we have a nice full house, and let's take advantage of it. So Pivotal Tracker is one of the 28 zillion tools we're throwing at you this semester, so welcome to real life. Its dashboard looks something like this. In fact, what I'll do is, I'll give you a real example of a dashboard from one of my own tracker projects. OK, so this is a dashboard from one of my own tracker projects. And basically, the goal of this tool is to allow the tracking and partial automation of the process we talked about in the last session, where you're coming up with stories, you're chunking them into pieces, you're estimating how many points you think those pieces might be worth, and then tracking who's working on those stories. So the basic idea behind the tracker dashboard is there's 3 basic columns that show up. There's various ways to customize it, but we have sort of a recommended setup that we're going to publish. In our recommended setup, there's the icebox, the backlog, and current. So icebox is basically where do you put user stories that came out of a customer meeting, so stuff you know you have to do, but it has not necessarily been prioritized yet. You don't know which ones are most important. It has not necessarily had a point estimate assigned to it yet, so you haven't gone through the exercise with your team of figuring out how complex they are. Once a story becomes pointed and prioritized, it can move into the backlog. The backlog, the big difference compared to the icebox is these are stories that are in priority order. So if it's higher up in the backlog, it is more important, and it needs to be done before stuff that's lower in the backlog. Even if the stuff lower in the backlog looks cool because it's adding JavaScripty animations, the stuff at the top is what, because the customer meeting, you have all agreed is what deserves priority. So as people from the team or pairs from the team start picking up work to do, they really should be picking it up in the order from top to bottom in the backlog. Everything in the backlog has had a person assigned to it, or a pair if you're doing pair programming, and it has a point estimate assigned to it. Number of points, depending on which scale you use. We're recommending the geometric 1, 2, and 4 scale. You can see that some things in the backlog have this little bug symbol next to them. Those are actually not new stories. Those are bugs. And in a minute, we'll talk about the similarities and differences between how you use this to manage stories, which is basically about adding new functionality, versus how you use it to manage bugs, which is fixing stuff that arguably should have been got right when you did the story in the first place. Okay? So that's the basic tracker setup. You can open each one of these. Oops, there we go. If you open a story, there's a panel where you can do you can edit various properties of the story, the number of points. I'm I'm the only person on this project right now, so it's going to get assigned to me when it does get assigned. Right now, it doesn't have an owner. You can slide stories up and down to reprioritize them. This is a live project, so I'm not going to be doing that. When you're ready to start a story, so it's been prioritized, it's been assigned to somebody, it has a point value estimating how hard it is. Whoever is picking up that story will click the start button. That moves the story over into the current iteration, which is the last of the 3 panels, and it's what you're doing now. So every story that some programmer or pair of programmers is actively working on will find its way into the current iteration column after you've clicked the start button. And in a moment, we'll go through what the different values, accept, reject, finish, what do all these different things mean? Because in terms of the way you run your project, they have very specific meanings. Okay, so that's an overview of what it looks like. Let's talk about what it does for you, I suppose. Rather than walking you through everything about the tool, I think I just gave you the basic idea of what it's supposed to do. They have an awesome website where, depending on how you prefer to learn, you can either read 5 short articles or you can watch 5 short screencasts where they basically show you how to use the tool. And you'll see that they use a lot of the terminology that we have been using. They talk about stories, they talk about points, estimating complexity, they talk about velocity. One of the key concepts they don't necessarily talk about as much, but we will implement for your teams, is that for each iteration, there will be a designated person on the team who is the voice of the customer. So if you're in the team meeting, you need to make a decision, the customer is not in the room with you, there's someone whose job it is to basically try to behave the way the customer would have behaved. And we'll try to arrange it so that you get to rotate that role and different people have a chance to do it. Like I said, this aspect of dealing with stories in the planning phase is actually really important. So you absolutely should expect questions on the exam and stuff like that about the story lifecycle. So now that you're paying attention, let's talk about the story lifecycle and what those categories mean. So like we said, the icebox, stories that you know you have to do, but they have not yet been prioritized, they haven't been started, they haven't been assigned to anybody. The backlog, which is stories that haven't been started yet, but you have gone through the exercise of estimating the difficulty, and in conjunction with either the customer or the product owner, you have prioritized which ones are the most important. Those are the ones that you're agreeing to work on next. And the current iteration, which is the stories that are in progress. Somebody is right now developing code and tests to make that story happen, which implies that depending on whether you're doing single or pair programming, only one story should be in progress by any developer or by any pair at a time, right? Now, does that mean that there will never, ever, ever be a case where a pair is working on 2 stories instead of 1? No, sometimes it could happen. For example, sometimes you find you begin to work on one story, but what you didn't realize before is that that story actually depends on some other story. And you can't make progress on the first one until something is done about the second one. So in that case, you can either have 2 stories that are both started, or if you want to sort of be squeaky clean and really follow chapter and verse, you can change the first story back from started to not started, because you can change the story state to either go forward in time or backward in time. Then you can start the story that it depends on, and when that story is finished, now you can restart the one that you began originally. So it might happen that you'll have more than one story open, but in general, you'll find that your code base is easier to manage and your work is easier to track if you try to keep the rule of thumb, remembering that in a team of 6, if there are 3 pairs, that means there are 3 stories open at any given time. That means you're going to have 3 different pieces of work that have to be cleanly merged into the master. So when you're working on something just by yourself, having multiple things open is not a big deal. But when there's a whole bunch of other people on your team and everybody is working on stuff, the more total stories are open, that's going to be like the square of that is the pain of trying to merge stuff, right? And the likelihood that you'll have a merge conflict and want to throw something at somebody. Was there a question here?
So on the previous example you showed of your thing, there were a lot of stories in the current category.
Yeah. So
were they completed, or were some of them dependent on others, or how come there could only be 1 in progress but you had lots?
I had like 3 or 4 in progress, right? So, can I come back to that? Part of the answer is that right now I'm the only one on that project. So if I have like 4 stories in progress, it probably means I've got 4 different branches, and at some point I'm going to have to merge them. But the 4 stories are in different parts of the code, and I'm the only guy right now. So it's okay. It's really, what this rule is about is preventing things from happening in the team that other people don't know about. If you've got 4 different pairs all working on 3 different stories per pair, there are sort of 12 things happening in the team, and it's going to be hard for the rest of the team to sort of keep tabs on that. So the fewer people are involved, the more you can relax this. But there's also another part of the answer, which I'll get to in a moment, and it has to do with what the different states of a story are when they're in progress. So the story life cycle. And I have conveniently color-coded it, with apologies to people who have visual issues with colors, but I tried to pick ones that are representative. Stories in the icebox, they've just been created. And the next thing that's going to happen is you're going to estimate points. That's what's happening in your planning meeting, like planning poker. That moves a story into the backlog. And in the backlog, stories have been prioritized, and then they get assigned to a developer or to a pair. Once the pair picks up a story and begins it, that moves it into the current iteration, and it's in the started state. They will continue to develop code and tests until they declare the story to be finished. Once the story is finished, it is delivered. That means it is deployed in some version of the product the customer can see, or at least that the product owner can see. Sometimes the customer may not have time right away, but at least the product owner who speaks for the customer, in the delivered state, the product owner should be able to actually exercise the story, and it should work. And when the customer finally sees it and customer tries out the functionality, they say, yep, this is what I asked for, I sign off on it, then and only then does it become accepted. Okay, so this last step is the critical one because the team doesn't get to say when the story is accepted. The customer says when the story is accepted. So what does this mean in terms of the story lifecycle? What's happening at all these stages? The stories are created. That comes out of your meeting with the customer. The stories are estimated. This is where you have a team meeting, and coming out of that meeting, at least a subset of those stories have had their difficulty estimated through the planning poker process. Then they get prioritized, they get assigned to people. Once a story is started, that means people are working on code and tests for that story. When we talk about how to keep your team's work nicely coordinated, we will recommend that you use a methodology called branch per feature, where you make a new branch in your GitHub repo, and that branch is only for the purpose of doing that one story. As soon as the story is closed out, the branch is incinerated. Okay, so we'll talk about branch per feature a little bit later. When a story is finished, that has a specific meaning. It means that there are code and tests that are checked into the repo on that branch, and if anybody in the team was to go into that branch, they would be able to run those tests and the code would actually work. Right? So finished means not just the code, but the tests that cover that code are in place and should be expected to be passing. We will show that there are ways you can automate this using continuous integration so that anytime you push a branch, you can immediately tell if you broke something if you have decent tests. Delivered has a specific meaning. It means that it is deployed somewhere that the customer can see it. Probably in your case, it'll be deployed on Heroku in like a staging environment. And then when the customer or the product owner, if the customer is not available, actually inspects and interacts with the deployed feature and agrees that it matches what was said in the customer meeting, then the story becomes accepted. That's when the story is finished and not before. And finally, estimating velocity is at the end of every iteration, how many stories have gone from step 1 created through step 7 accepted. The number of points of all of those stories is basically your instantaneous velocity for that iteration. And Tracker automatically calculates that and also sort of smooths out the average over 3 or 4 iterations of the project. Who does each of these things? The story creation phase, well, that should be everyone because you should all be present at the customer meeting when you're discussing what you're going to work on next. Similarly, you should all be at the team meeting where you're doing the estimation. The product owner really sort of gets to break ties on prioritization because remember, their job is to sort of keep track of what the customer said was most important, what they said they wanted, and make sure that that is reflected when the stories are prioritized. Assignment, it could be the product owner, but again, this is a case where if there are particular people on the team, let's say, who have expertise in certain technology, and there's a story that really would benefit from that, it makes sense to have that pair or that person work on that story. So teams can usually sort of self-regulate, but in the worst case, the product owner can break ties. A story is started, so whoever owns the story, there's always a story owner. You can also assign a pair of owners. And then the product owner, or the customer ideally, is the one who gets to say accepted, and the tracker tool itself is what estimates your velocity. Okay, so it's a simple, but it's a surprisingly eye-opening way of tracking how much code is actually sort of in flight, which is stuff you've started and maybe you've kind of finished, but you haven't really tried it in live mode yet, or maybe it's live, but you haven't gotten final sign-off. We have found Tracker to be super, super useful for doing all of that stuff. Everything that you're seeing in terms of how I use Tracker, you can set up a free account, and you can set up a test project to use it. For the course projects, we will set up a tracker for you, because I have an academic account with superpowers where I can have like infinite number of projects, and every project can have infinite people. And you can't do that with the free account. And that means that the GSIs and I will have visibility into your tracker as it should be, so that we can sort of keep tabs on whether teams are really using the tool effectively, and hopefully that will help them turn out better code. Because there are a lot of ways to misuse Pivotal Tracker and this process. One of them I already mentioned on Tuesday, which is the temptation to divide up the work by layers. So instead of saying the story is to deliver this functionality end to end, you tend to break it up as, OK, one story is do the front-end pages and JavaScript. A different story is do the server-side part. Another story is writing the tests. Don't do that, right? A story is, even if it means that the amount of stuff in the story is small, the story tends to touch every layer, and that works to your benefit. Bugs. A bug is a story, but it's not. It is a story in the sense that it has a life cycle. And we'll talk more systematically about what a disciplined bug life cycle should be. But if someone discovers a bug and it's reproducible, so it's a bona fide bug, then that bug has to go through basically the same process as a story, right? Someone has to be assigned to work on it. It has to be prioritized. Is this like a killer bug that is going to screw up the app for the customer, or is it a rare case and maybe it's not as high priority right now? Someone has to write the code has to be tested, it has to be merged. The only real difference between handling a bug and handling a feature in Pivotal Tracker is that if you designate something as a bug, it gets 0 points. Because the idea is you shouldn't be counting time spent fixing bugs as time that counts toward velocity, because velocity is basically how much business value did you deliver to the customer this iteration. Now, you could argue fixing a bug is business value, because if you didn't fix the bug, the app wouldn't work. But the 0 points convention is to basically say the business value was in the feature in the first place. If the feature is worth 4 points of business value, and you think you delivered the feature, but it turns out there was a bug, you haven't actually delivered 4 points of business value, right? You're sort of not finished yet. So that's the reason that we encourage the use of Tracker where bugs don't get points. Because it really kind of encourages you to think in advance about, have you covered as many cases as you can? But other than that, they need to be tracked. They have a life cycle just like stories do. Using Tracker as a to-do list. This is probably the most common misuse of Tracker, where rather than sort of really being disciplined about this process, you tend to say, oh, right, we just sort of checked in the code that does all that, and we deployed it, and the customer liked it. So you end up having a story that doesn't really exist. You quickly create it, then you move it to the icebox, then you move it to the backlog, then you move it to current, and then you mark it as done. Basically, all you did was make a to-do list that has 4 steps for doing a to-do item. That's not useful, because every time a story does something in Tracker, if it moves from one category to another, if it gets started, finished, Tracker records when each of those things happens. And part of the goal of using the tool is over time, you will get better at estimating your own team's ability to complete stories. And how complex are they really, and how likely is it that they'll result in bugs you have to clean up afterward. But if you just use it as a to-do list, if you don't actually follow the process of saying, OK, before a single line of code is written, has the story been prioritized? Has it been assigned points? Do we know who's working on it? Has a branch been created? If you don't follow the process, then Tracker can't really help you, right? It's designed to help you get better at this, and this is a really, really useful skill, and it is very hard. I've been doing this for years, and I'm still working on my ability when I say, that's a 1-point story, which to me, I use 1 point as meaning I can sort of knock it out in about half a day's worth of work. And for me, a 2-point story is if I have a whole day uninterrupted, I could knock out a 2-point story in that day. And I'm right, like, maybe 2/3 of the time, maybe 3/4 of the time. I'm not right all the time, and I have done this quite a bit. So it is really worth your while to try using the tool the way it was intended to be used, because we think that that will help you get better at doing this more quickly. And we've actually got other monitoring that we're going to be deploying that will basically tell you whether it thinks you're using Tracker correctly. So it is a tool to track how you use the tracking tool. How's that for meta? And that's basically it for Pivotal Tracker. Like I said, there's these tutorial videos. They're not hard to do. We encourage you to play around with the free account. We will create accounts for you that have all the necessary features for doing the projects. A lot of the projects, because we're picking up from previous projects, already have a Pivotal Tracker. So you're going to actually see some stories that the teams before you who were working on that project got to complete.